The popular conception of the struggle in the air over Northern Europe during World War II is of squadrons of sleek fighters racing over the German heartland to protect streams of lumbering bombers stretching beyond sight. This is as it was during the second half of America's air war against Germany, but it was as far from the truth as is possible to get at the start of that great aerial crusade. It took until late 1943, nearly 2 years after the United States entered the war, before the 8th Air Force mounted strategically significant bombing missions against targets in Northern Europe. The fault for this lay partly in the availability and slow development of equipment, but it's also a fact that the two men at the top of the 8th Air Force command structure stubbornly clung to old and discredited theories that stunted the effectiveness of the strategic bombing effort. In the beginning, fighters were assigned to guard installations on friendly territory. Until late in 1943, the use of the fighter as an offensive weapon was stunted by the defensive mindset of the interwar decades. Between the world wars, the development of fighter aircraft was hobbled by budgetary restrictions to allow the development of heavier and faster bombers.
France, Russia, and Britain. As a correspondent, I went to the War Department. Air Corps leaders showed me what they were doing with limited funds. I was surprised to find that working with American industry, the generals had started planning a long-range heavy bomber as early as 1933. Specifications had asked for an aerial dreadnought of tremendous...
Inevitably, American bombers of the late 1930s were designed to be self-defending because they could fly much farther and at somewhat faster speed than the fighters of the day. Fighters were assigned to guard cities, industrial targets, and air bases.
Thus, the nation was provided with small mobile air forces, theoretically capable of spotting and intercepting an enemy before he could get within striking distance. And if necessary, planes could be dispatched to reinforce American bases in Hawaii, Panama, or Alaska.
As soon as the Army Air Corps was pulled into World War II, it became focused on the defenses of American coastal cities, several Caribbean islands, bases in Greenland and Iceland, and on the strategically indispensable Panama Canal. Through the first half of 1942, all of the very few pilots and airplanes that could be spared from the defense of the U.S. coasts and sea lanes were rushed to defend Australia and the South Pacific. Fortunately, the U.S. could afford to be a bit late off the mark in the war against Germany. German efforts in 1940 to bring Britain to her knees had failed, and by the end of 1941, the bulk of Germany's air and land forces were mired in a war of attrition deep inside Russia. The British had the situation in Northern Europe well in hand, with the vast infusions of weapons and supplies from the U.S. sustaining them. British forces in Egypt and Libya were on the edge of defeat, but there was little the U.S. would be able to do for many months to influence the outcome, assuming the British held on that long. So while the Army Air Forces devoted the bulk of its limited expendable resources to defensive measures against Japan, new air groups were created, and new and better combat aircraft began rolling off newly created assembly lines. Finally, in the spring of 1942, it was decided in high Army Air Force circles to commit American air power to Northern Europe. Brigadier General Ira Eaker arrived in England on February 20, 1942, to establish the headquarters of the new 8th Bomber Command. He was later joined by Frank Hunter, who established the headquarters for his 8th Fighter Command. But the 8th Bomber Command had no combat airplanes to its name. They wouldn't be available for several months. Rather, it fell to Eaker to argue with his British hosts in favor of an independent role for the forthcoming Army Air Forces in Europe. Eaker's idea was bolstered by the fact that the Army Air Forces had developed over many years a theoretical strategy air doctrine that was quite different from the RAF's experience-based strategic doctrine. The Americans favored and had equipped their bomber force to wage a precision daylight bombing campaign against industrial targets hundreds of miles inside enemy territory. The RAF was the only other air force in the world that have developed long-range, four-engine heavy bombers, but its doctrine favored area bombing at night. The first 8th Bomber Command unit to arrive in England on May 10, 1942 was the 97th Heavy Bombardment Group, which was equipped with B-17 heavy bombers. This was a symbolic commitment The 97th had been activated in February 1942 and thus had not had time to be adequately trained to fly combat missions over heavily defended European targets. It would be weeks before the 97th saw any action. On June 10, 1942, personnel of the 31st Fighter Group arrived in England by ship. After being outfitted with British Spitfire fighters, the Green American Fighter Group was to begin rigorous advanced combat training overseen by a number of the RAF's leading Battle of Britain aces. As with the 97th Heavy Bombardment Group, the 31st Fighter Group was not expected to begin combat operations for several weeks. The Army Air Force's first combat mission against a German-held target took place on July 4, 1942. 6 American Douglas A-20 bombers accompanied 6 RAF manned A-20s in an attack on several German airfields in the Netherlands. 2 of the American A-20s were shot down, 2 failed to reach the target, and a 5th was severely damaged. The U.S. Army Air Forces could not have asked for a less auspicious or more humiliating inauguration of what would become the greatest aerial offensive in the war. The very first mission of the 31st Fighter Group over Europe took place on July 26, 1942. As a part of their training syllabus, 6 senior pilots joined an RAF fighter sweep to Gravelines, a French town on the English Channel. German fighters challenged the American and RAF Spitfires, and the 31st Fighter Group's deputy commander was shot down and captured. The 97th Heavy Bombardment Group had to wait until August 17, when a dozen B-17s, with General Eaker along as an observer, conducted an afternoon raid against railroad marshalling yards near Rouen. Escort for the bombers was provided by 4 RAF Spitfire squadrons. The results of the mission were negligible. 1 B-17 was damaged by a German fighter, but there were no losses and no injuries. 2 days later, on August 19th, the entire 31st Fighter Group, along with the RAF, supported the Ally raid at Dieppe. While completing 4 12-plane missions over the beaches during the day, pilots from the 31st were officially awarded 2 confirmed and 2 probable air-to-air victories. The 31st Fighter Group continued to fly fighter sweep missions over coastal France, but it was awarded only 1 probable and no confirmed victories before it was withdrawn from combat operations in October to prepare for its upcoming role in the invasion of French Northwest Africa. Meanwhile, on September 12, 1942, the RAF's 3 independent American Eagle squadrons were absorbed into the 8th Fighter Command as the new 4th Fighter Group. Thanks to the withdrawal of other 8th Fighter Command groups for the North African campaign, the 4th Fighter Group was the only operational American fighter unit in Northern Europe until May 1943. Between mid-March and April 8th, the 4th Fighter Group was withdrawn from combat so it could transition from Spitfires to P-47 Thunderbolts. The group's first aerial victories in the P-47 were scored on April 15th over the Belgian coast, and by the end of April the group accounted for 16 German aircraft. The main reason why the 4th Fighter Group attained negligible results during this period was Major General Hunter. Hunter was a product of his training and, to a degree, poor technology. Both of these factors obliged him and his eager fighter pilots to work apart from the 8th Air Force's other combat arm, the 8th Bomber Command. The bombers had been built and the bomber crews had been trained to attack enemy targets without protection from fighters. Even as late as 1942, Allied air strategists honestly believed that wars could be won by bomber campaigns alone. Since the mid-1930s, Americans who accepted this outlook had developed what they called the self-defending bomber. That innovation, however, had more to do with the fighter technology of the 1930s. Fighters of the day possessed neither the range nor the speed required to protect modern bombers. Fighter technology improved, but by mid-1942 the concept of the self-defending bomber had taken on a life of its own. It was believed that Germany could be bombed into submission by long-range self-defending bombers without a fighter escort. The key to every decision Allied commanders made in 1942 and 43 was the projected invasion of France. At first, when the U.S. entered the war, it was hoped that the invasion would take place in mid-1943. By the late summer of 42, however, the North Africa campaign and a huge number of other factors made it clear that D-Day was going to be delayed until mid-1944. The primary mission of American and British air forces in Europe from mid-1942 until the invasion was to defeat the Luftwaffe. The defeat of the Luftwaffe was of primary concern to the Allies because at heart it was constituted as a tactical ground cooperation air force. It had been developed in its entirety to support ground operations. Its bombers, for example, were light or medium models, and its bomber crews were trained to support ground troops at close or medium range. This is one of the reasons why the Luftwaffe alone was unable to overcome the RAF as a strategic objective in 1940. It was too lightly built to undertake a purely strategic mission. As a superb tactical air force, however, the Luftwaffe was an enormous potential threat to an invasion fleet or a fledgling toehold on the soil of France.